From the outside, everything looks fine, maybe even perfect. You've got the job, the relationship, the daily routines that run like clockwork. You smile when expected, show up on time, do what's needed. To the world, you seem stable, functional, alive. But inside, something is unraveling. Quietly, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It begins with a vague sense of discomfort. Not quite pain, not even sadness, really. Just a fog, a restlessness, a sense that something is missing, though you couldn't say what. There's no clear event to blame, no obvious trauma, and yet your chest feels heavy when you wake up. Your laughter doesn't quite reach your eyes. You move through the motions like a ghost rehearsing a role. And when you pause, if you ever do, there's a stillness that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels hollow. This is the first whisper, the soul's subtle rebellion. It's the quiet moment when your essence begins to reject the crumbs of love, of attention, of meaning. When you fed yourself on just enough for so long that your spirit finally says, no more. This unease is not weakness. It's not failure. It's not depression in the clinical sense, although it can evolve into that if ignored. This is the soul refusing to sleepwalk any longer. What no one tells you is that the beginning of awakening doesn't feel like light. It feels like loss, like confusion, like a weariness that doesn't go away even after rest, like standing in a familiar room and suddenly feeling like a stranger, because what's crumbling isn't your life. It's the illusion that it was ever enough. It's the identity you crafted to be loved, to be accepted, to be fine. It's the persona you've worn for years, polished and presentable, but disconnected from the truth of who you are. At first, you try to fix it logically. You rearrange your schedule, you book a trip, you try yoga or journaling or smoothies. Maybe it helps for a while, but the feeling returns, because the hunger isn't physical, the ache isn't external. It's your soul asking for more. More depth, more truth, more alignment, and less of everything else. But in a world that celebrates function over feeling, this inner unraveling is hard to name, harder to explain. So most people don't. They swallow it, they numb it, they call it just stress or burnout. They convince themselves that everyone feels this way. And for a while, that lie is enough to keep going until it isn't, because something deeper has awakened. And now it refuses to go back to sleep. This process is often lonely, even terrifying, because it challenges everything you thought you needed, the relationship that no longer feels right, the job that slowly drains your spirit, the roles you play to keep others comfortable. The soul doesn't care about comfort. It cares about truth, and truth at first can feel like destruction. But what if that's not a breakdown, but a breakthrough? What if the emptiness is not a void, but a space being cleared for what's real? This is the moment of sacred discomfort, the beginning of a reckoning. The invitation to look beneath the surface and ask the questions you've been avoiding. Who am I really? What do I truly want? What am I afraid to let go of? These are not small questions. They are tectonic. They shift foundations. They demand honesty. But they also offer something most people spend their lives chasing: peace. Not the peace of perfection or control, but the peace of living in alignment, of becoming whole. And so if you're in this space right now, where nothing is technically wrong but nothing feels right, know this: you are not broken. You are not alone. You are being called, not by the world, but by yourself, by the deepest, most authentic part of you that refuses to settle anymore. Listen, because the soul always whispers before it screams, and if you can be still enough to hear it, you'll realize this is not the end. It's the beginning. The quiet start of something true, the first sign that your soul no longer tolerates crumbs. Sometimes the whispers of the soul are subtle, a tear that falls without warning, a sigh you didn't know you were holding, a pause in a conversation where suddenly everything feels off. Other times it's more visceral, a tightness in your chest when you open your inbox, a wave of dread before a meeting, a sense of being drained by people you once cherished. It's easy to dismiss these signs. You're busy, you're responsible, you've got obligations, and besides, who has time to fall apart? But this isn't falling apart. This is truth surfacing, because when the soul is denied, when it's buried beneath roles, routines, and responsibilities, it doesn't disappear. It waits, and then it starts to rise. At first you may feel ashamed. You may think, I have no right to feel this way. Others have it worse. You might even feel guilty for not being grateful. That's part of the trap. The idea that gratitude should silence longing. But longing is not ingratitude. Longing is sacred. It points to what you're meant to become. The soul doesn't ask for more because it's greedy. It asks for more because it remembers. It remembers your wholeness. It remembers the life you came here to live, not the one you were taught to survive in, but the one you were born to create. And so the restlessness intensifies. The fog thickens, until the day you stop pretending, until the day you whisper back, I hear you. That is the turning point. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. A moment of quiet defiance against the lie that half alive is enough. From here, everything begins to change. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, as you start honoring the feeling that something more is calling. That what you feel is not nonsense, it's a compass, and maybe, just maybe, that ache you've been carrying isn't a flaw, but a doorway, the kind only your soul knows how to open. There comes a moment when the realization dawns. You have been living on crumbs, not just scraps of food, but fragments of meaning, diluted affection, and half-hearted presence. These crumbs manifest in various forms. The emotionally distant relationship that leaves you perpetually longing, the job that strips you of vitality while convincing you to be grateful for the paycheck, or the routines that keep your days busy, but your heart untouched. In a world where burnout is worn like a badge of honor and emotional suppression is praised as maturity, it becomes alarmingly easy to convince yourself that this existence is acceptable. You learn to settle, to minimize your needs, to quiet the voice inside that tells you this is not it. And over time, that voice grows fainter, not because it disappears, but because you've gotten better at drowning it out. We are conditioned to survive, not to thrive. From a young age, we are taught to be realistic, to expect disappointment, to aim not for joy, but for stability. This conditioning makes it seem reasonable to endure toxic relationships, soul-deadening work, and life, paths that were never truly chosen, but inherited or imposed. And because this misery is so widespread, we begin to see it as normal. However, normalization does not equate to health. Just because everyone else is gasping for air doesn't mean suffocation is the standard. When you live on crumbs long enough, you forget what it feels like to be nourished. Joy becomes a distant memory, peace an abstract concept, and you start to believe that life is meant to be endured, not enjoyed. This slow erosion of self often goes unnoticed at first. You wake up with a strange heaviness, a reluctance to engage with the day ahead, even when nothing is overtly wrong. You fulfill your roles, maintain appearances, and continue checking boxes, yet something vital feels absent. It's not always easy to articulate this void. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It lives in the sigh after a conversation that left you empty, in the fatigue that sleep cannot fix, in the subtle disconnection that grows between you and a life that once felt safe. And still you push through, because that's what you've been taught. That endurance is noble, that asking for more connection, more meaning, more authenticity is a sign of weakness or entitlement. So you stay, in the job, in the relationship, in the routine. You stay not because it feels right, but because it's familiar. Yet the soul keeps score. It remembers the moments you silenced it, the times you said yes, when everything inside screamed no. It remembers the dreams you buried under layers of practicality, the parts of yourself you abandoned to belong, to be loved, to be safe. Eventually, the internal tension becomes unbearable. The mask slips, the performances exhaust you, and what once seemed like comfort now feels like confinement. The crumbs that once kept you going begin to disgust you, not because they've changed, but because you have. This is not a breakdown. This is the awakening. It is the soul reminding you of your hunger, of your capacity to feel deeply, to love fully, to live truthfully. It is the moment when you stop rationalizing half-lives and begin demanding wholeness, not from others but from yourself. You may find yourself pulling away from relationships that once defined you, from habits that once soothed you, and from narratives that no longer fit. This shedding is not selfish, it is sacred. It is not rejection, it is return. Return to what is real, to what is whole, to what was always yours before the world taught you to settle. True nourishment does not scream, it doesn't compete, it waits quietly, patiently, until you remember, until you are ready to choose it again and again, even when crumbs are more convenient, more praised, more common. But once you've tasted the real thing, connection without pretense, work that fuels your purpose, a life that reflects your inner truth, you cannot go back, not truly. The soul won't let you. It's a process, not a single decision. Some days you might still choose the familiar crumbs because they're easy, or because fear whispers that you're asking for too much. But each moment of clarity adds up. Each act of honesty, whether it's saying no without guilt or walking away without apology, reaffirms your commitment to yourself. And with time, the internal compass grows louder, more confident, less willing to bend. You start craving quality over quantity, in conversations, in love, in how you spend your energy. You begin to move not from fear of lack, but from the knowing that you are already whole. And as you shift, your world begins to reflect that inner change. The scraps that once felt like sustenance no longer satisfy, not because you're ungrateful, but because you're finally remembering what you were made for. And you were never made to starve. At first, the discomfort is subtle, a persistent tension in your body, a heaviness behind your eyes, an inexplicable weariness that no amount of sleep can resolve. It's easy to dismiss it as stress, to blame it on the weather, your schedule, or the passing nature of a bad day. But deep down you know something is shifting. Then come the dreams, not just random flickers of memory, but vivid symbolic visions that repeat with eerie familiarity. You dream of losing your voice, of wandering without direction, of doors you cannot open, or houses you once knew falling apart. These dreams are not meaningless, they are messages, coded transmissions from the unconscious, echoing what you've suppressed in the daylight. And then, the synchronicities. The strange, uncanny moments where everything aligns just so. Someone says the exact phrase you were thinking. A book appears with the answer you didn't know you were seeking. A song starts playing that mirrors your internal monologue. It feels like coincidence until it happens again and again. These are the soul's breadcrumbs leading you back to your deeper self. Your body joins the protest. Aches appear without cause. Fatigue clings to you no matter how well you rest. There are no medical explanations, no diagnoses that offer real relief. Because the root isn't physical, it's existential. It's your essence rebelling against a life that no longer fits. And perhaps most painfully, your relationships begin to shift. People you once resonated with now leave you drained. Conversations that used to excite you now feel hollow. You find yourself longing for solitude, for authenticity, for silence, because in silence something real finally speaks. These are not signs of falling apart. They are signs of a deeper reassembly. What feels like decay is often transformation. What appears to be disorder is often your inner architecture reshaping itself to house a larger truth. Yet, because these signs are subtle, most people ignore them, or worse, they medicate them, suppress them, rationalize them away. They seek to return to normal, not realizing that normal was the very thing suffocating them. Carl Jung understood this intimately. He recognized that the psyche sends signals when we stray too far from our true path. What modern culture might label dysfunction, Jung called invitation. The unconscious begins to surface not to destroy us, but to restore us. It is not punishment, it is guidance. This process is sacred, and it is relentless, because once the soul awakens, it does not forget. It becomes persistent. It will not allow you to go back to sleep. The signs will intensify. The more you ignore them, the louder they become. Until one day, something gives, a breakdown, a crisis, a rupture so undeniable that you finally stop. And in that stillness, when everything else falls away, you are forced to confront the truth. The life you were living was never truly yours. That truth hurts, but it also heals, because within it is the seed of rebirth. You begin to understand that your symptoms were sacred messengers, that your dreams were guiding maps, that the aches were your body's way of pleading for alignment, that the relationships fading were making space for those who truly see you. This is not the end. It is the beginning of real listening, of inner dialogue, of awakening not just to pain, but to possibility. You start asking different questions, not just, how do I fix this? But, what is this trying to show me? Not how do I go back to how it was, but what part of me is ready to evolve? This is the soul's curriculum, a non-linear, unrepeatable journey inward. It demands patience, surrender, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. But through the discomfort, a new language emerges. You begin to understand your dreams. You trust the synchronicities. You honor your body as a barometer of truth. You listen to your longing, not as a flaw, but as a compass. And as you do, the chaos begins to feel less chaotic. It starts to feel like a kind of order, an ancient, soul-driven architecture rising from the ruins of your false life. You begin to notice that even your smallest choices start to carry more weight. What you say yes to, where you place your energy, what you consume, who you allow near your spirit. These decisions feel less like habits and more like sacred acts of self-respect. You start to rebuild your life, not from fear or survival, but from reverence for your truth, for your time, for your soul's language. And as this new alignment forms, you realize the signs were never meant to scare you. They were meant to bring you home. When the soul begins to resist the structures that once held it, it's easy to feel lost, adrift in confusion, unsure if you're breaking down or waking up. It's in this sacred confusion that Carl Jung's work becomes a lighthouse, illuminating not just the symptoms of discomfort, but their deeper meaning. Jung believed that the human being is not meant to simply adapt to the world, but to individuate, to become whole. The process of individuation is the soul's journey back to itself. It's not about self-improvement in the traditional sense. It's about self-realization, about uncovering and integrating the forgotten or rejected aspects of who you are. He called this hidden dimension the shadow. The shadow is not inherently dark or evil. It's simply what has been exiled from your conscious identity. It can include the parts of you that were shamed in childhood, the anger you were told to suppress, the creativity dismissed as impractical, the sensitivity mistaken for weakness. But it also holds your unlived potential, gifts, instincts, and truths you had to abandon to fit in, to be accepted, to survive. To meet the shadow is to reclaim your wholeness. But this is not a comfortable task. The ego resists. It clings to the familiar identity it has built over years. And yet, the soul pushes forward, demanding authenticity, demanding integration. The process of individuation, then, is a dismantling. As much as it is a building, it requires that you see yourself clearly, not just the curated version you present to others, but the full spectrum of who you are. The light, the dark, the broken, the brilliant. And this journey is never linear. It's cyclical, spiraling deeper with each realization, each surrender, each courageous step into the unknown. The more you embrace your complexity, the less power the shadow holds over you. You begin to respond instead of react. You choose truth over performance, and your life starts to align, not with societal expectations, but with your own inner compass. Jung did not promise comfort. He promised depth. He knew that wholeness is not found in perfection, but in integration, in holding the paradox, in recognizing that the path to self is a descent before it is a rise. It is through this descent, through facing the shadow, through honoring the symbols of your dreams, through listening to the body and the heart, that you begin to experience not just moments of awakening, but a life rooted in depth, meaning, and inner authority. And perhaps this is what the soul has been asking for all along, not a better mask, not more external success, but the courage to become real. In a culture that rewards conformity, the act of individuation is radical. It asks you to step away from the crowd, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. To recall the truth that who you are is not a role, not a label, not a resume, but a living, breathing paradox of vulnerability and power. This path invites you to move beyond dualities, beyond good and bad, right and wrong, and into the nuanced reality of your own psyche. It also requires solitude, not loneliness, but intentional stillness. A space where the inner voice can emerge without interference, where the fragmented parts of your being can come together in conversation. And in that silence, you meet not just yourself, but something greater. Jung called this deeper center the self. Unlike the ego, which wants control, the self wants coherence. It orchestrates your healing through symbols, patterns, and crises that might seem random, but are profoundly intentional. And when you begin to align with it, life no longer feels like something to endure. It becomes something sacred to live. There comes a moment when the internal pressure becomes too great, when the structures of your life no longer just feel off, they begin to crack. This is the breaking point, a threshold that no one plans for, but many are secretly carried toward. It may arrive as a quiet unraveling or as a dramatic rupture, a divorce, a death, a diagnosis, the loss of something you thought you couldn't live without. On the surface, it looks like everything is falling apart, but underneath, something ancient is waking up. The ego, which has worked tirelessly to keep your world intact, can no longer hold the weight of what you've outgrown. It shatters not because it's weak, but because it's too small to contain who you're becoming. What feels like collapse is often expansion in disguise. Pain becomes the teacher, and though the lessons are brutal, they are also precise. The grief, the confusion, the emptiness, they're not random. They are the soul's way of getting your attention, of inviting you to stop reaching outward and finally look within. This is when many people resist. We cling to the old stories, the familiar patterns, even as they burn. We tell ourselves we can fix it, return to normal, get back on track. But the track is gone. The map is obsolete. And the only way forward is through uncharted territory. In this terrain, logic falters. Control is a myth. What you're left with is rawness, a nakedness of being that is as terrifying as it is honest. You begin to see clearly, not because you found answers, but because everything that was false has been stripped away. This is the sacred power of the breaking point. It breaks illusions, it breaks roles, it breaks cycles, and it brings you to the most vulnerable and fertile place a human can stand, the edge of what was, staring into the unknown of what might be. Here, many people meet their most authentic self for the first time. Not in victory, but in surrender, not in certainty, but in openness. You realize that your worth was never tied to the things you lost, that your identity is not defined by your productivity, your relationships, your titles, or your plans. It's something deeper, something unbreakable. This is also the place where real healing begins, not the kind that comes from fixing, but the kind that comes from presence, from being with what is, with the tears, the numbness, the silence, with the questions that have no immediate answers. Jung called this process the night sea journey, descent into the depths of the unconscious, where transformation occurs not through effort, but through trust. It's a rite of passage. And like all rites, it demands that something be sacrificed. Often what is sacrificed is not something tangible, but a belief, a self-image, a loyalty to pain, to pleasing, to pretending. The breaking point forces you to ask, what have I been? Clinging to that is no longer true, and slowly a new kind of strength emerges, one that isn't loud or performative but rooted. A strength born of survival, yes, but more than that, a strength born of seeing clearly and choosing differently. In the ruins of the old life, you begin to feel seeds stir. They are not ready to bloom, but they are there, waiting, trusting you. We'll meet them with patience and honesty. This is the paradox of the breaking point. It is both the end and the beginning. It is the soul's insistence that you were meant for more, not in the way the world defines it, but in the way only you can understand. You start noticing how the pieces that once held your life together were not actually supportive. They were survival mechanisms, stitched together by fear, duty, and the need to belong. The breaking point reveals this with painful clarity. It shows you where you were never truly met, where you played roles to be accepted, where you silenced yourself just to keep the peace. And now, that silence has become too loud to ignore. In this raw place, you may find moments of unexpected grace, a conversation that touches your core, a book that opens a forgotten door, a stranger's kindness that makes you cry. These are not coincidences. They are threads, subtle signs that even in your undoing you are being held. And as you begin to gather yourself, not as who you were but as who you are becoming, you may notice something else. The fear that once kept you small no longer rules you. You've walked through fire. You've survived the collapse. And now, even without knowing what comes next, you are more honest, more present, and more free than you've ever been. This is where the real life begins. After the breaking, something remarkable begins. It doesn't look like triumph. It doesn't even feel like clarity at first. It feels quiet, grounded, a subtle shift from performing to being. You begin to notice that the masks you once wore no longer fit, not because the world told you to remove them, but because your soul refuses to suffocate under them any longer. This is what it means to start living from the self. Carl Jung distinguished between the ego, the constructed identity designed to help us navigate society, and the self, the deeper, truer essence that holds all of who we are. To live from the self is to move from a place of inner authority. It means no longer outsourcing your truth to culture, family, or fear. And this shift is profound. You may find yourself speaking differently, slower, with more intention. You start noticing the energy behind your words and the spaces between them. You stop saying yes out of guilt. You begin to honor your no, not as rejection, but as protection of what truly matters. Living from the self also means reevaluating everything. Your relationships, your work, your daily habits. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. You start asking, does this nourish me? Does this reflect who I am becoming? Does this align with what I now know to be true? As these questions deepen, your boundaries sharpen. Not as walls, but as invitations to yourself and others to meet in truth. You are no longer willing to shrink in order to keep the peace. You recognize that peace without authenticity is just silence dressed up as harmony. This is the medicine of authenticity. It doesn't always feel good, it's not always received well. Some will misunderstand you, some will leave. But what remains and what grows in that space is sacred. You begin attracting people who speak your language, not because you tried to fit in, but because you dared to stand out. You also begin to reclaim lost parts of yourself, the artist who stopped creating, the healer who abandoned their own wounds, the dreamer who stopped dreaming to become realistic. These parts return not as relics of the past, but as keys to your future. Living from the self requires trust. You no longer move by default, you move by design, aligned with your intuition, your values, your soul's rhythm. This rhythm might be slower, more deliberate, less noisy, but it is powerful. Because it is yours, you start to embody congruence where what you feel, what you say, and what you do are no longer in conflict. Your life begins to echo your inner world, and in that harmony, there is strength. Not the strength of domination, but of coherence, of knowing who you are and allowing that truth to shape your path. This kind of alignment cannot be faked. It must be felt, lived, and embodied. It shows up in the way you hold eye contact, the way you make decisions, the way you allow others to truly see you, flawed, evolving, whole. And it liberates not only you but everyone around you. Your authenticity becomes a permission slip for others to stop pretending too. Of course, this path is not without loss. You might lose people who are more connected to your mask than your truth. You might feel lonely, adrift in a space between who you were and who you are becoming. But this loneliness is different. It is not abandonment, but spaciousness. Space to grow, space to breathe, space to finally belong to yourself. And in that space, something beautiful begins to take root. You no longer seek validation to feel worthy. You no longer chase applause to know you matter. You realize that your being is enough, that you have nothing to prove, that your presence, when rooted in the self, is already a gift to the world. The more you live from this place, the more you understand that integrity is the foundation of freedom. You no longer compromise your values to be liked. You no longer silence your intuition to avoid conflict. Instead, you begin to embody your truth in quiet, consistent ways. And life responds. It doesn't always give you what you expect, but it starts offering what aligns, opportunities that match your essence, relationships that honor your depth, experiences that reflect your inner evolution. Living from the self doesn't mean you are immune to pain, but it means you are no longer afraid of it. You've made peace with discomfort. You've learned to let the truth cost what it must, because nothing is worth more than living a life that is actually yours. And once you taste that freedom, there is no going back. Something extraordinary happens when an individual begins to live from their soul. Though the journey may feel deeply personal, even lonely at times, it has ripple effects far beyond what the eye can see. The decision to live in truth, to honor your essence, becomes a quiet revolution. And every act of authenticity you embody becomes a spark that touches others. Carl Jung introduced the concept of the collective unconscious, a shared psychic inheritance composed of archetypes and universal experiences. When one person heals, confronts their shadow and chooses wholeness, they don't do so in isolation. They contribute to the energetic field we all share. Their transformation adds light to the dark, coherence to the chaos, and possibility to the places others have abandoned. It might begin subtly. Someone watches you speak your truth and feels a twinge of courage rise within them. Someone witnesses you walk away from a dynamic that no longer nourishes you, and it plants a seed. Maybe I can too. You weren't trying to teach, but your presence became a mirror. This is the paradox of personal awakening. It's deeply intimate, but never solely individual. The more you live in alignment, the more your very being becomes a form of service. You don't need a stage. You don't need a platform. Your life is the teaching. Your integrity, your boundaries, your joy, your grief, they all radiate into the world around you. And those vibrations call others home to themselves. We are connected in ways that modern society often fails to acknowledge. But our souls remember. They recognize resonance. They feel truth when it walks into the room, and in that recognition something shifts. It might be unspoken, but it's felt. It lands in the body. It whispers, there is another way. This is how collective transformation begins, not through force or dogma, but through example. Through each person who chooses to stop betraying themselves, who chooses to leave behind survival for the sake of embodiment, who chooses to no longer tolerate crumbs. And the more of us who make that choice, the more the world changes. Not by grand design, but by quiet revolution. Each person who dares to face themselves, to unlearn conditioning, to meet the discomfort of change, becomes a sacred disruptor in a world addicted to numbness. And their presence alone, rooted in truth, challenges the dominant narrative. It suggests that fulfillment is possible, that wholeness is not a myth, and that alignment is worth the cost. You may never know how far your healing echoes. You may never see the way your courage inspires a sibling to leave an abusive relationship, or how your boundaries help a friend realize they've been betraying themselves. But trust this, every time you choose authenticity over approval, every time you speak instead of swallow your truth, you help someone else believe it's possible for them too. This is the invisible architecture of awakening. We're not just healing for ourselves. We're weaving a new pattern into the collective psyche, one that honors emotional honesty over perfection, depth over performance, truth over comfort. And so, as your inner world transforms, your external world starts to rearrange. Your relationships evolve, your work shifts, your presence begins to magnetize others on a similar path. Without preaching, without pushing, you become a tuning fork for truth. Because when you stop accepting crumbs and start living as if you truly matter, you light the way for others to do the same. and that is how one soul changes the world. There comes a moment, a holy trembling moment, when you decide to stop accepting crumbs, not out of anger, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence for your own soul. And in that moment, everything changes. Because the act of refusing less is the act of remembering more. This is where the feast begins. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't look like perfection. It looks like alignment, like waking up and feeling your breath fill your chest with a sense of rightness, like saying no without guilt and yes without fear, like looking in the mirror and recognizing the person staring back. The feast is not about quantity. It's about depth, about connection that nourishes, work that reflects your essence, solitude that heals rather than isolates. It's about finally living a life that matches your insides. You stop performing. You start participating. You begin to choose love not for what it gives you, but for how freely it flows from you. You let go of roles that never fit, stories that never served, dreams that were never really yours, and in their place something ancient returns, your wholeness. The silence you once feared becomes sacred. The emptiness becomes a canvas. The discomfort becomes a teacher. You realize that nothing was ever missing. You were simply disconnected from what mattered most. This is the reward of the journey, not a prize you earn, but a life you reclaim. A life lived from the root, from the truth, from the deepest yes you've ever known. But this arrival is also an invitation to continue asking the questions that brought you here. Where am I still accepting less than I deserve? What part of me have I silenced just to be loved? What is my soul asking of me now? Let these questions be the altar. Let your honesty be the offering. Let your life be the answer. Because in the end, this journey was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you were before the world taught you to forget, before you were conditioned to settle, before you were taught to fear your own depth. The feast is the place where your essence is no longer edited, hidden, or compromised. It is where you show up unapologetic, present, and whole. And yes, there will still be days of doubt, moments of fear, echoes of old habits trying to pull you back into shrinking. But the difference now is that you know what your truth feels like. You've tasted it. And once you have, you can no longer pretend you're satisfied with less. This is the sacred sobriety of awakening. You become allergic to what once numbed you. You can't unknow what you've seen. You can't unfeel what your soul has touched. So let this be a new kind of homecoming, not just to your power, but to your softness, to your sensitivity, to the parts of you that always held the wisdom but were told they were too much. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were just too real for a world that prefers the artificial. And now you are building a world from the inside out. One choice, one truth, one sacred breath at a time. So take your seat at the feast, not because you fought for it, but because you finally remembered. You've always belonged here.